Hey everybody, welcome into the podcast. We are back with another special bonus episode. Today we are resurrecting our My Favorite Movie series. It's been a little while since we've done this. This is the series where we sit down with a master distiller or a CEO of a distillery, and we talk about their brand, we talk about different expressions of their whiskey, but we also talk about their favorite film. And today, Brad, we are joined by somebody that I have been waiting to talk to for years. I'm so happy to have this opportunity. We are joined by Chris Morris, who is the master distiller at Woodford Reserve. I cannot tell you, Brad, how excited I am to get into this. Woodford has meant a lot to us over the years, and I hope we get a chance to convey that today. But Mr. Morris, thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Very fine. Thank you, Robert and Brad. What a great introduction. I'm overwhelmed.
Well, it sounds like we're off to a good start. We're interviewing Mr. Morris here the week after the Kentucky Derby. As you all know, it got delayed into September. I definitely watched, and I definitely had a mint julep. But as you know, if you're a fan of the Kentucky Derby, Woodford Reserve is the sponsor of the Kentucky Derby. They are the official bourbon of that horse race. And I have to ask, just right off the bat, what is Derby week like at the Woodford Reserve Distillery? I mean, I know that your marketing and PR people must be going crazy, but from your point of view as master distiller, is there anything that the distillery does to kind of ramp up for the Derby each year?
Well, it certainly does. And obviously this year was an exception, Robert. But normally, and we have been the official bourbon now for 21 years, so we've got 20 normal years under our belt of having Derby weeks. And literally the distillery is flooded with visitors, and special outdoor areas are set up, tents are set up, fabulous dinners are served, lunches. It's one big celebration throughout the week. It's just so fun. And unfortunately, this year it was quiet, as you can imagine.
Yeah, and you had to be a little bit excited. I have a friend whose father works for Spendthrift Farms, who was part owner of Authentic, and I know that you guys work personally with Spendthrift as well. So that had to be pretty exciting for you guys to see him win.
Yes. And I remember last year going to Bob Baffert's barns back on the backside and visiting with Bob and his lovely wife. And again, we weren't able to do that this year. It would have been fun to have been in the Derby winners' stables prior to the race, of course, not knowing Authentic would win. But I did because he was my bet. But in Spendthrift, as you know, is an old friend, as are many other of the great horse farms in Woodford County and in neighboring counties. So it is a special time for us.
Well, it sounds like Derby week was just great all around for you personally and professionally.
Yes, we still had a lot of fun. We did a lot of virtual meetings and tastings and presentations, and the network had come out a couple of weeks ago to the distillery, and all with the proper cautions, filmed some of the spots that were on the national telecast, and we were filming segments for Churchill Downs' social media, and just a lot of fun. And we still had that Derby attitude going all the last couple of weeks.
Well, if we could step back for a moment, you know, we're going to get to what it's like to be the master distiller at Woodford Reserve. But I want to walk through your bio with you a little bit here. I am just so impressed at how many different positions that you've held in the industry and for how long you've been doing this. Chris actually began his career in bourbon in 1976. And according to his bio, he was a trainee in the Brown-Forman lab. And I think it's really great to see somebody that kind of came up through, you know, the R&D and the science background of things that has come all the way up to being a master distiller. Brad, we've talked to quite a few master distillers, and not a lot of them actually seem to come up through the ranks that way.
Yeah, and honestly, for me, I am a whiskey drinker, but I'm not a whiskey scientist. And I was wondering, for like any of our listeners who are not whiskey scientists, what's the coolest sciencey thing about the process of making whiskey? Like, is there anything that you just think is really, really cool or neat that you could explain to our listeners?
Oh my gosh, well, that's a big question. There's so much, so much we do know and so much we still do not know about the science, for example, of maturation, what happens to our spirit in an oak barrel. We can analyze the contents of the barrel of Woodford Reserve and know exactly what's in that glass, but how did some of them get there? We still don't know. And that's, I think, the interesting thing. We're always learning about our wonderful product and the processes we use. And just the debates. I had a nice conversation with a Hall of Famer from Scotland who disagreed that water has an impact. And I thought it did. But of course, their water doesn't have an impact because they don't use the water we have. I mean, it's just good fun. Always good to have debates.
One of the things that reading your bio really stuck out to me, Mr. Morris, is that you joined Brown-Forman at a time when the bourbon industry was really kind of on the decline. You know, the 70s and 80s were especially low points in terms of sales. And I'm just kind of wondering, what was it like for you, you know, just starting out in the industry to come in at that particular time? You know, what kind of innovations did you see the industry have to create to get over the hump? And what was it like kind of seeing the industry right the ship, you know, from the inside at that time?
Well, quite honestly, Robert, when I joined Brown-Forman in 76, that was right at the peak of bourbon, just at the very peak. I remember the old timers saying every year we put down, we'll grow 3%, and we will. I mean, it's just like, they were just so proud that you didn't have to think a lot. You just made more every year.
Sure.
Again, I hit it right at the peak and everything went downhill from there. Boom. So I remember in the mid 80s thinking, will we have jobs in the future? Brown-Forman was diversifying. We were running the Brown-Forman Distiller just 3 months a year. You know, things weren't looking good at all. And I've seen the trough. I've seen the depths of the decline, obviously. And Woodford Reserve is part of the story about the rebound of our industry and moving on to the new era. Our industry has always had eras of ups and downs and challenges. And just as we're getting our feet back under us, here comes COVID and other things and tariffs. And we'll battle through them and keep on going.
Well, and with you being promoted to Master Distiller at Woodford Reserve in 2003, you know, I think a big part of the shift back towards whiskey has been all of the crazy experimentation that's going on. And that's, you know, partially what you're really known for. You know, you created the world's first bourbon to be finished in Chardonnay and Pinot Noir barrels. So, like, talk to us about that. What made you say, hey, you know, bourbon has been in this place for this amount of time. We need to push the envelope. You know, what brought you to that place?
Well, certainly during those early years, there were no whiskey magazines. There were obviously no podcasts. There were no books being written about whiskey. The last book that had been written about whiskey was in 1964, Gerald Carlson's Social History of Bourbon. And then there was nothing, because who cared about whiskey or bourbon in general? And then we see Michael Jackson publish his encyclopedia, and with Waymack and Harris and Gary and Marty Regan in the early 90s start to write books, and the magazines start to come out about whiskey in general and bourbon specifically. But there was a general theme that bourbon could not innovate. Bourbon was painted in the proverbial corner, and Scotch whiskey can be innovated because, of course, Dr. Bill Lumsden had given us the first port finishes and sherry finishes and Madeira finishes, and just doing terrific things in Scotland with single malt scotches. And that ticked me off. I'm a competitive person, and I certainly know Bill Lumsden and others, and nothing against them, but like, who says we can't innovate?
Right.
Just because the rules say we always have to use a new charred oak barrel to be bourbon, who cares what the label actually says if we make something that tastes good? So that competitiveness to show these individuals, these writers, that we can be innovative, we started experimenting with finishes, obviously going into used barrels, Chardonnay barrel, Pinot barrel, port barrels, sherry barrels, you know the story. And we got a lot of grief for it. How dare they? How can they? It's not bourbon. And like, read the label, folks. It doesn't say bourbon. It says bourbon finished in a Chardonnay barrel, for example. I mean, you had to say that, and that was the truth. Now it's taken for granted. Everybody's doing it. But we took a chance. It was, again, some rough times personally. If it failed, I was in trouble, but not in really trouble, but it wouldn't have done much for my career. But you take a chance, and it worked. So it was more of a competitive response to people saying we could not do anything. And we sure have done it now. Red corn, blue corn, white corn, using cherry wood smoked malts and chocolate smoked rye malts and things like that in our Masters collections and distillery series. Even with COVID, not people recognize we just put out 5 wood. It's gone now. The first whiskey to touch 5 different barrels. Again, we keep on the edge. Just sometimes people don't notice anymore, I guess, because there's so much going on.
Well, I mean, you're hitting the nail on the head here. One of the things that we wanted to talk to you about was the idea of the Masters collection at Woodford and how that came to be. And in doing a little bit of research, we found that the idea for the Masters collection came from this internal document that you created, which was called the Woodford Reserve Charter. And I am really interested to hear what was the basis for that. What did it mean for you to be able to put something down on paper and say, this is how we're going to define this brand moving forward?
Brown-Forman, the oldest spirits company in America, our 150th anniversary this year, also owns the iconic Jack Daniel's brand since 1956. And Jack Daniel's had a distillery charter that was written in 1955. And this is how we're going to run the distillery, how we're going to run the brand. And I thought that was just brilliant. We need a charter too. And so I wrote one. And I took the words of Owsley Brown, the late Owsley Brown, our chairman of the board, who was responsible for the creation of Woodford Reserve. It was his vision to create this new bourbon brand. And Owsley said that the distillery was going to be the home of innovation. And I took that to heart. We're going to innovate. And I don't know exactly what he meant by that because he's passed away and I wasn't able to ask him. But I put my own interpretation of innovation, which means a lot. And also, just because a distillery is in Kentucky doesn't mean it can only make bourbon, Kentucky bourbon. And when I realized that, it was a freeing moment for me. The weight was off my shoulders. We can make whatever whiskeys we want. And of course, we made Kentucky's first ever single malt. We didn't call it single malt in the Masters collection. We made the first 100% rye whiskey in the history of Kentucky. We made the first of so many types of whiskeys because we can do it because we can.
Well, and I think that there's no better example of that than the whiskey that we have in front of us right now. Woodford Reserve was kind enough to send us samples of their double oaked expression, which is incidentally one of our very favorite bourbons in the world. I cannot wait to get into talking about it. But one of the things that I love so much about double oaked is that it has one of the most unique backstories for a bourbon that we've ever seen, Brad.
Yeah, you guys took kind of this double oaked idea, but you guys were the first ones to use not just like a second used barrel, but a second brand new barrel. So why was that important to you? Did you know that would make it a better product, or was it genuinely just kind of saying, hey, let's throw it against the wall and see if it sticks? Because I'll tell you this, it definitely has. It is spectacular.
Well, thank you. Our rye whiskey, our malt whiskey, our wheat whiskeys have all come in some form or fashion from the Masters collection, as does double oaked. So we had created seasoned oak finish. I studied a lot about the impact of aging wood out of doors. And the seasoned oak finish, it was just a wonderful whiskey in the early Masters collection. And we took fully mature Woodford Reserve and finished it in brand new charred oak barrels that had been made from wood that had seasoned or set outside for up to 5 years, which is about 4.5 years longer than anyone ever has used before. And having that experience, that was information in the back of my mind of what impact various woods have and styles of wood. And getting a lot of requests from consumers for something special on an everyday occasion. We had our standard Woodford bourbon, and then we had the Master's Collection. I mean, you talk about two very far apart propositions. You can buy the standard bourbon every day. You can't get the Master's Collection hardly ever. Mm-hmm. And people wanted something special every day. And I thought, well, we don't have 8, 9, 10 years to develop an everyday special whiskey. And it literally dawned on me, and I was out taking a walk one evening. We're going to finish Woodford Reserve in a brand new barrel. Bing. Now I got to get a little more developmental than that, but that was the basis of the concept. And of course, we have our own cooperage, the Brown-Forman cooperage, and having your own cooperage means I can walk into the cooperage and let's start developing experimental barrels based on toasting and charring, which are how oak gives us their flavor. And that led to about after a couple of years of work to the double oaked barrel, which is a heavily toasted 40-minute toast and a very light 5-second char barrel designed to finish Woodford Reserve. And no one ever made a barrel specifically for the whiskey going in terms of finishing. The fully mature Woodford goes into the second barrel between 95 and 98 proof, a very low entry proof, fully mature whiskey again, and up to a year, depending on the flavor, in the finishing barrel. Again, that goes to my philosophy of flavor and finishing, which is never put Woodford Reserve in a barrel that has flavors in it that Woodford Reserve doesn't have, number one. And also, everything other than our bourbon has to highlight or focus on one of the 5 areas of American whiskey flavor. In other words, to highlight one of the spokes on the American whiskey flavor wheel. Our rye focuses on spice, our wheat focuses on fruit, our malt focuses on grain, and double oak is designed to focus on sweet aromatics. Again, so you have to have a philosophy, you have to have a rationale. In other words, you have to have a roadmap. How are we going to get here, and how is this going to deliver that promise? So double oaked was designed according to those parameters, and it came out better than I expected.
Well, I think that is an understatement, sir. And, you know, we did not let anybody in on this, that we were going to tell you this up front, but we actually just recorded an episode of our podcast where we featured Woodford Double Oaked as the whiskey of the week, and we gave it a full review and everything else, but we talked a little bit about our own backstory with Double Oaked. And that is that, you know, Brad and I both lived in Kentucky for a time. We were going to grad school, and when I first moved to Kentucky, I said I really want to try going on the bourbon trail. And I was not a bourbon drinker at the time. And the very first place that we chose, which was the closest to us, was Woodford. And so the first tour we ever took, my wife and I, was Woodford Reserve. We thought it was an incredible tour. And at the end, they gave 2 little samples and a bourbon ball. And the first sample was the standard Woodford expression, which I really liked. And they said, okay, now take a sip of the double oaked. And Woodford Double Oaked was the whiskey that got me into drinking whiskey. And so in a way, I don't think this podcast would exist if it wasn't for Woodford Double Oaked, because that was the one that really made me understand, okay, I get why people like bourbon. I can taste something different here. I didn't have the language at the time, but that really became the one that started me off on this journey of drinking whiskey and bourbon in particular.
Well, that's a terrific story. You know, our assistant master distiller, Elizabeth McCall, speaks to lots of women's groups and women wine clubs and things like that. And so many of the people she talks to say, I don't drink whiskey, I don't drink bourbon. And when she tries them, just as you expressed on Double Oak, they're like, oh my gosh, I can drink whiskey. This is a whiskey I can drink. It's like, you know, we just given them a new reason to live. It's just tremendous. I think that is very true of so many people who try Double Oak. It just opens their eyes to our industry. It maybe breaks the misconceptions, the stereotypes of bourbon as being rough and harsh, or whatever the case might be in someone's mind. And I'm so glad to hear your story, because that really confirms what we keep hearing.
Yeah, Chris, I've actually run into the same thing. You know, I work at a winery where I live, and I'm also a little bit of a coffee snob. And what I've realized is that all of these different products, whether it's wine or whiskey or coffee or tequila, all of them have really cool, interesting things that can diversify the palate for the beverage. But all of them are convinced that their beverage is like the only one that can be unique and crazy and interesting. And they want to reduce all the other ones down to like, oh yeah, it's bourbon. It's just harsh and it only tastes like caramel and that's it. And I'm like, well, no, like all of them are unique and interesting. And for me, trying all of these different things, widening my wine palate, widening my coffee palate has helped me appreciate whiskey even more. And appreciating whiskey even more has helped me appreciate those other things. So I just feel like there's so much potential to enjoy all of these things rather than just saying, well, no, I'm just a wine drinker, just a whiskey drinker.
Well, and to that point, even within our own company, my friend, our winemaker at Sonoma-Cutrer in California, Mick Schroeder, he's been putting our award-winning Pinot Noir in used Woodford Reserve barrels, and it's just awesome. And we've been putting our used double oak barrels into special releases of Herradura tequila down in Mexico, and it's a $130 bottle of tequila. So again, we start to cross-pollinate flavor profiles with Woodford and double oaked, and lots of microbreweries love Woodford Reserve used barrels. I think it's just tremendous, and I would never say I love a good glass of wine or a tequila. They're just different flavor profiles.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and the beautiful thing that we're talking about here is the evolution of all these different products. And I think that another category you could put that into is movies, right? Whenever you look at film, you see this evolution where film noir turns into, the films that you get in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so you can see all these different influences. And Chris, we were told that you have two movies that you are kind of torn between to talk about. So, Bob and I just said, heck, let's just talk about both of them. You are curious about talking about The Day the Earth Stood Still from 1951, as well as The Searchers in 1956, which are two just spectacular movies. And I can easily see why you're torn between them. But why don't you fill us in? What makes you love these two movies so much?
Oh, gosh. Well, The Day the Earth Stood Still is black and white, and The Searchers is an absolute beautiful color. So they're both different presentations. The Day the Earth Stood Still is when science fiction movies became serious and intellectual and had a story about the world needs to stop nuclear proliferation or it's going to be destroyed, in this case by intergalactic policemen. But and the nations of the world have to get together and cooperate. We're one world, not the Soviet Union, not the United States, not India, as obviously portrayed in the movie.
Your choice is simple. Join us and live in peace, or pursue your present course and face obliteration. We shall be waiting for your answer. The decision rests with you.
I think that message is even more important today. So here was a science fiction story, which had special effects, which were awesome for the time. Well, they're still pretty good. And, but a good message. And of course, The Day the Earth Stood Still, how can you peacefully tell the world to, hey, pay attention? And that, of course, is what CLAT 2, the intergalactic policeman, does. And also it just has fabulous actors, Patricia O'Neill, Michael Rennie, a lot of good stock characters you'll recognize in other movies. It was just, I watch it quite often. I mean, quite often, a couple of times a year now. But
sure.
It just had a message, and it's an exciting story too. And if you want to see Aunt Bee from Mayberry when she was a nasty, mean lady prior to Mayberry, she is.
So, Chris, I'm wondering, both of these movies are from the 1950s, and especially The Day the Earth Stood Still. When did you first see these films? Were you a young person when you first saw them, or did you discover them, as an adult?
Well, The Day the Earth Stood Still, I'm sure I saw back in the early 60s when one of our local television stations, Wave 3, had a movie they would play in the afternoon, back when there were only 3 stations. And if it was a rainy day or if it wasn't in the summer and we weren't out playing in the yard, we would watch the movie. And it was always something that would interest kids, of course, cowboys and Indians, and Ray Harryhausen movies, things like that. And so I'm sure I saw it then. And The Searchers, I did not until I was an adult studying. I get the big books on movies and this and that, and big John Ford fan, but also a big John Wayne fan. And what a good combination of Ford and Wayne. And I did not know The Searchers until I saw it for the first time. What a artistic masterpiece it is. And of course, it's consistently rated as one of the top Western genre films ever produced. And it's physically, visually striking. Of course, a great story. Again, a moral. It has some funny moments. It has serious moments. And again, what a group of actors and actresses, from Natalie Wood, Ward Bond, and all of John Wayne's cronies who he took from movie to movie with him. I love that aspect of it too. He was a very loyal person, and he had the same cast of characters in many of his movies. Harry Carey Jr., for example. And I really like that. I like that loyalty that we don't seem to have in a lot of places anymore.
Yeah, you mentioned that this is a great John Ford movie. It's also a great John Wayne movie. We've done some reviews on movies that they've done in the past. And I'm curious, why do you think that Wayne and Ford just did so well together? What was it about their chemistry that they just made great films?
Well, I love that term, chemistry. And again, thinking about how it pertains to our industry. Ford and John Wayne, the Johns, they went back to early Hollywood when John Wayne was like a gripper and then a stuntman for John Ford. So he knew him from a young age. They knew each other for so many years. And they just, obviously you can't work together all the time in Hollywood, but they grew up together. And it's sort of like in our industry. I cherish the time I had with my mentor, Lincoln Henderson, who's no longer with us. Still, of course, the great Jimmy Russell over at Wild Turkey, who's been so kind to me. And over in Scotland, Richard Patterson, people you have met and known for years, and you might not see them for a couple of years, and all of a sudden you're together. Let's have a drink, and you're reliving old times. So our industry, these long-term relationships, have been so important to me in my development and the great opportunities I've had. And I think that's reflected in the relationship that John Ford and John Wayne had.
Before we move on in asking questions about the movie, I just want to point out that one of the things that we love, in particular about the bourbon industry, is that even at the level that you all are working at, where, we're talking millions and millions of cases that you all are moving each year, there seems to be a real camaraderie and a sort of friendly competition among master distillers, even at your level. And I'm wondering if you could just maybe press in just a little bit more on that, because it's pretty rare to find an industry as big as the bourbon industry where people seem to really know and appreciate and respect each other, even if they are competitors.
Well, certainly, I think the industry as it develops here in Kentucky prior to Prohibition worked together because it was always under attack, always under threat from the temperance movement, the pre-Prohibition movement. And, you had to ally together to survive. And then a lot of the early bourbon barons owned multiple distilleries. So you had master distillers working together because their ownership was the same person or persons. And then you had a lot of cross-pollination. Like our founder, George Garvin Brown, in 1870, he was buying whiskey from a number of distilleries, 3 distilleries. Their owners, he's naming kids after him, and they were so close, and they worked together, even though they were different distilleries.
Yeah.
And so we grew up that way. Coming out of Prohibition, of course, we rebonded and grouped together. And my father here working at Brown-Forman, he was always going to dinners and meetings with the other distillers. And I just grew up with that. We're having dinner here and I'm the host tonight, or so-and-so was the host tonight. We drank their whiskey. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense to a kid. And that's the way it is. And so today we do the same thing. We get together less frequently now sometimes because everything's so big, as you mentioned. There's so many demands on our time that we don't quite get together like we used to, unfortunately, but we still do. There's festivals and events we might all be at together, share the stage together. Some of us, not all of us. It is a camaraderie, male and female, and I really appreciate that. And I do think it's interesting because this is the only industry I've been in that other industries are not like that. They are cutthroat. You're a competitor. I can't even be in the same room with you. And we don't have that problem.
Well, I think what you're talking about, Chris, is that there's just a lot of trust between the competitors that, like, hey, we're all working towards the same goal. We want to put out really good whiskey. And I think when I think about the Searchers, one of the reasons it works so well is because I think that the Johns trusted each other. And that leads to one of the very few movies that you see John Wayne as the bad guy in. And I'm curious, how did that sit with you that, this is not your typical John Wayne film, but I think he kind of shines because of it.
That's a good observation. And again, it can be quite troubling if you think of these great Western stars as as the knights in white shining armor, the white hats, and they're always wonderful. And yes, he's quite dark in this movie. There's this tension throughout the movie and these subplots and personalities. And he is focused absolutely on his hatred and of the thought that his niece has been kidnapped by Native Americans. And it can be troubling. And then he sort of redeems himself. I think he does redeem himself at the very end when you expect him to kill his niece.
No, Ethan! No!
Let's go home, Debbie.
And he picks her up and says, let's go home. And that brings tears to your eyes. So, yeah, he was quite the dark character.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that really sets this apart as a John Wayne film. But you were kind of hinting a little bit earlier that the artistry of what John Ford is doing here, the camera work in this movie, it is just a gorgeous film. Is there anything about it, the themes, the performances, what sets this apart from every other Western for you that catapults it into being your favorite one?
It really is filmed with an artist's view. And if you like the art of Remington, for example, it's almost that opening scene of looking out the door out into this stark yet colorful landscape. It's a painting. There's a series of paintings in this movie that are just terrific. And it just wasn't shoot 'em up, go, go, go. Every scene was designed visually by Ford, and it's just striking. And how and it ends at that same doorway. I mean, how poetic. You open and close the movie in the same doorway. That's so cool.
Well, Chris, you mentioned earlier that you're kind of a fierce competitor. And with that in mind, we here on the Film and Whiskey podcast do our seasons with 32 movies. And at the end of each season, we take the movies, we put them into a March Madness style bracket with the premise that each movie we choose to go on means that the other movie is thrown into the fiery chasm, never to be viewed again. Now, if I put The Searchers and The Day the Earth Stood Still into that bracket, which movie would you choose, and which movie would you throw into the fiery chasm never to be viewed again?
Oh my gosh. What a tough decision.
Well, welcome to our pain, my friend.
Oh gosh. Of course, I chose two polar opposite visual movies. My gosh. And of course, The Searchers has never been repeated. And the Day the Earth Stood Still has.
Oh, sure.
The new version.
Right.
Yeah, we don't have to talk about that one.
Yeah, I know. Thank you. But maybe because of that, I'm going to have to sacrifice The Day the Earth Stood Still and go with and advance The Searchers if that's possible.
Well, we appreciate you going through this. Like Brad said, this is the hardest mental gymnastics we have to do once a year to go through all of our favorite films and find reasons to try to pluck them out of the fire. But you heard it here first, folks. We are throwing The Day the Earth Stood Still, his apparently favorite film, into the fiery abyss, never to be watched again. So
we didn't even talk about the film scores, the music. They're both brilliant.
Oh, truly great. But what I'm hearing now is that you're trying to rescue this film even as it burns here.
Yeah, see, I don't want to give up.
Well, Mr. Morris, we are so grateful to have you on the show today. You know, we've interviewed a lot of distillers and a lot of CEOs, and it's always a good time to do this episode, but rarely have we had someone on the show that represents a product that is so near and dear to our hearts. And so, honestly, what Woodford Reserve has been to us, we can't overstate it. And I just want to thank you for setting us on this journey that Brad and I have been on together. Honestly, we could not have done it without you.
Well, that's so kind. And again, I really am thankful that you discovered Woodford Reserve Double Oak, and we had the chance as a result of that to speak today.
Everybody, this has been Chris Morris. He is the Master Distiller at Woodford Reserve. Chris, thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you both.